Welcome to our session this evening. We appreciate you joining us and being interested, and I'm responding tonight to several that have requested that I give some personal experiences. They call it my stories. So I'm going to weave together a couple of testimonies of good friends of mine with my own personal experience. So this is not a Bible study, but certainly is a testimony that will glorify what God does in our life. If you are not familiar with the geography of Russia, you might want to look at a map or a globe. On the far east end of Russia, there is a peninsula that seems to drop down pointing south, and it looks like a great big finger pointing at the island of Japan. So the peninsula called Kamchatka is as far east as you can go in Russia. Russia is so big it covers 11 time zones, which is just gargantuan as far as the span. Kamchatka is in the far east, and if you go any further east, you'll get wet in the Pacific Ocean. So it's far, far east. It's 9.5 hours in a jet flight from Moscow, so you know it's a long ways away. And we've been there a number of times, so we'll refer to that later. But this is where this story transpires and is located, and it's as far away from here as you can imagine, as far as the remoteness, the primitive situation, and how it has been treated through the years. So just a little brief history of Kamchatka. For many years, Kamchatka was given the status of a highly restricted military region because located on this peninsula was a secret nuclear submarine base, Russian of course, and as well as an extensive undercover spy training center that was there for the Russian government. And so as a result, except for only two U.S. military inspectors, one of which I personally know, no foreigners have ever been allowed on the peninsula of Kamchatka. This is, of course, prior to the lifting, and we'll come to that. These two men worked for the Reagan administration. So in the 80s, they went in there to count missiles as representatives of the U.S. government. And you'll remember, some of you recall the phrase from Ronald Reagan, "You trust but verify." So this was the verification of the Soviet missile count. But the restriction was very strict, very high, and even, this is hard to believe, even Soviet citizens had to obtain a special visa for travel permission to visit Kamchatka. No foreigners at all, and even citizens of the Soviet Russia. So absolutely no effective Christian ministry of any sort was developed in Kamchatka during the era and the rule of the Soviet Union. But under international political pressure, and I believe the guidance of the hand of God, things begin to change in that part of the world. For in the Soviet Union, or the USSR as we used to know it, the governmental system that had been in place since the revolution in 1917, led by Vladimir Lenin, completely collapsed. This occurred on December 26th, 1991, and it was a momentous day for that country. So governmentally and structurally, suddenly 15 countries became independent nations, no longer under the USSR protectorate and under the banner of the socialist republics. Now they're independent. You'll recognize most of them, I think, and those countries are Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan. Those 15 countries came out of the USSR and were now independent. So what I'll call unprecedented freedom, along with the revolution of the Iron Curtain that came crashing down in 1991, there came a cultural revolution within the country of Russia. As the government disintegrated and many countries became independent of the old Soviet rule, an openness and a freedom came to the central country of Russia itself. It was during this time that a new level of awareness of biblical Christianity emerged. It is somewhat difficult for us as non-Russians to understand how joyful these new Christians were as they simultaneously experienced freedom in their government, freedom in their culture, freedom to meet and worship without fear of punishment or retribution, and a real spiritual freedom that's only found in a relationship with Jesus Christ. All of that happened at the same time or within a very short period of time. What I call a national split personality developed. There came a cultural contradiction among the Russian people. On the public, in the public situation or on the street, Russians are relentlessly rude and unpleasant to meet. That's the public part. Because of the way in which the government has treated them in the past, a deep suspicion exists in most people, and rightly so. If you're not in the old system, if you didn't have a good dose of suspicion, you won't be around very long, because they will take advantage of you and violate many, many kinds of your personal rights. However, in private, the mood and the reception was very different. For the Russian people, I have found, are warm, generous, and very loyal. But that's in private. So that's why I call it the split personality of the culture. Of course, on the outside, we see the brutality and the coldness of the government of the communists, and those people saw it too. But for most of us in the West, this situation seems to defy explanation. How can both of these things be true at the same time? One of the keys to understanding the Russian people and building relationships with them is the issue of trust. More precisely, there existed a deep emotional need for trust on a personal basis that existed because of the continued violation of trust by their own government. And so one of the really sad phrases culturally that I've discovered there during this time is this, that the tallest, this is what they say, the tallest blade of grass gets cut down first. And so you keep your head down. Most of the people would dress in black jeans, black leather jackets, black shoes. They kept their head down. They avoided cameras because the government was so pervasive and so punishing in its policies. We must be careful, though, and not be put off by the initial frosty reception or even the outright rudeness, for this is the normal expression for the Russian culture for the past 108 years. The communist takeover changed the culture in a major way. It's best as a missionary to keep extending yourself to them. Strive to be sincere and transparent in every situation, and you will then build a relationship where they can trust you without the fear of betrayal or abandonment. My personal contact, of course, is just my own personal experience, and other people in other functions have had other experiences that would be different than mine. We're also careful not to misinterpret their initiation in private of physical contact. Russians love to hug and kiss you as a greeting, and some have to adjust to flow along with that. On one hand, you may be greeted by a very warm hug and a morning min, by the ladies, the women, both older and younger. You would think that you're the long-lost grandson, and they would dote over you and hug you and draw you close. And you're not being propositioned or approached in any way like you think you would in the American culture. It's just their way of a cultural expression of affection. On the other hand, men, you may be greeted by the men with a very Russian bear hug that is close and personal, almost intimate. And if they are glad to see you, and you've seen them on press conferences and other international encounters, you'll get a kiss on each cheek. I mean, the diplomats and the bureaucrats and the politicians, the kiss on each cheek, men to men. Now, if they really, really love you, and this has happened to me only once, you may get a kiss full on the lips from a man. And in my case, I was startled because I didn't expect it. But here was a man who was the head of security at the biggest church in Far East Russia and had special forces experience in his background. He was a tough military man who ran a tight ship of security at a big church. So he wasn't something that you might suspect. He was just so glad to see me that day. It wasn't a proposition, it's just a greeting of affection. Food with fellowship is something that we're not completely used to in the West. One of the common elements in the Russian church is to enjoy some kind of a meal or a substantial snack served during or after church meetings, every church meeting. Some of this is based on their careful attention to drinking hot tea, which they enjoy very much as the British do. Sometimes between 4 and 6 times a day, they will stop for chai and have some tea, and it has to be hot, and the hotter the better for most of them. This is an opportunity, of course, to visit with one another and to experience some real fellowship and acceptance on a personal level. So even if you don't care for tea, if you're there, you drink it. You participate in the function. There's also an opportunity in that for church fellowship to serve those who are really in need of a hot meal. And there's that avenue that is very real as well. Many churches serve small sandwiches with some kind of soup, just be like a little cup of soup, maybe a very small bowl of some kind of soup, or borscht as they call it, and that would be made of a combination of beets and cabbage and potatoes, or maybe one or two of those. Rarely would there ever be any meat in the soup. Some advice that I would give to whatever culture that you may be visiting or planning a missions trip to: strip down your gospel message. This is difficult for some, at least from this country in the United States, to take out all your jokes, take out all your political references, all of your cultural references, all the little phrases and words we use. And for some men that I've seen, they just don't have much of a message left if they take all this filler stuff out, and they don't see it as filler, but communicating and connecting with the people. But in cross-cultural ministry training, and in addition to my experience now in 28 countries, multiple times, I've learned the better way to present the gospel as I see it. We always seek to be most effective in a cross-cultural situation, whether it's being in other countries or we are encountering people from another country here in the United States. And there are many enclaves in the United States. For instance, in the Portland, Oregon area and the surrounding community, there are probably 80 to 90,000 Russians in that part of our country. And you probably don't know that, but they have their own churches, they have their own stores, they have their own meetings, and they speak Russian. I believe it's critical in our presentation of the gospel that we remove any basis of salvation or any manifested grace of God from cultural underpinnings or any direct connection to the local culture. The gospel that has changed our lives is not some value system that is dependent upon a democratic form of government. The gospel is not based upon free market value system, or is it based on logical, humanistic, or secular views of the nature of justice. It is based completely and solely upon our relationship to Jesus Christ, our belief in Him as Savior, and our confession that He is our risen Lord. And you've got to keep your messages clean, clean from culture. And it's not as easy as it sounds. We have to work on that continuously. Romans 1:16 from the King James says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to every one that believes, to the Jew or the religious first, and also to the Greek or to the heathen." It is the power of the gospel of Christ that changes lives, not our persuasive techniques, not our illustrations, not our powerful doctrine. And I have a paraphrase entitled Pattern for Revolution. It's a small book that is out of print now and has been for about 30 years, and you won't be able to find it, but it is a paraphrase of the book of Romans in counterculture, cross-cultural language. And so I'll read you this one verse from that book, Pattern for Revolution. Verse 16 says, "I can share this news with complete confidence. As the unique message of unfailing love, it has the power to establish itself as the means of liberation to all who will commit themselves to it. To the religious person first, because he needs liberation from both religious and secular captivity, and also to the secularist." That's an interesting paraphrase that is with some counterculture language dialed in. Back to Kamchatka. In 1992, shortly after the fall of the USSR and that disintegration, President Boris Yeltsin opened the region of Kamchatka for travel for Russian citizens and for approved foreigners to visit. It still wasn't easy to get in. It's easier now, of course. A significantly meaningful crusade was held in the capital city of Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. And I won't say that name again because it's just quite a mouthful. Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky is the capital city. It's the largest city of the region of Kamchatka, and they boast about 240,000 inhabitants that live there. That visionary missions team was led by evangelist R.W. Shambaugh and by his crusade manager, Albert Cortez. Pastor Al and I met at the luggage carousel in an airport in Indianapolis, Indiana. Both his luggage and mine had been delayed, and we, along with our wives, were the only ones left in the entire facility. Everybody else on the plane got their luggage and off they went. And then here's these two couples, and we looked at each other across the carousel and began to visit. We discovered that we had both flown in from Houston, Texas, the intercontinental airport there, that day to attend the same national convention meeting. We were coming from the same part of the country, and then we'd come to attend the same meeting that was lasting that week. Offhandedly, I made a comment about waiting for delayed luggage in Kamchatka, and Pastor Al's attention was alerted. He remarked with some pleasure that it had been years since he had heard anyone mention Kamchatka, which is one of the most remote places on earth. It takes a long time to get there. When I traveled there, and have been there many times, sometimes it would take from beginning to end, counting layovers, connections, the fastest connections we could make, the time of flight would take 72 hours by the time I got off the plane at the destination. It just takes a long time to get from here to there. The story begins to unfold. Each of us took turns that day as he told me of the background of the gospel coming to Far East Russia, to Kamchatka specifically. In turn, I was able to share with him and tell him about the effect of the gospel after he had helped lead the big week-long crusade in Kamchatka. Because once they packed up and left after their 10 days there, they had not returned and they didn't have any follow-up message whatsoever. And I knew what had happened from that point forward. So it was a very wonderful meeting, not by chance, but by divine appointment, that we had our luggage delayed and met in an unusual way, and yet had a piece of the puzzle to share with the other one. Al had grown up on the streets of the Bronx in New York City. His parents were Puerto Rican immigrants, but they had abandoned him to be raised by much older grandparents, and they simply could not effectively manage an energetic 5-year-old with a severe speech impediment. So you can imagine the dilemma they were in, and Al, but as a wonderful result, was witnessed to and converted on the streets of the Bronx, converted to Christianity at a very young age. Because he didn't have anything to do and he didn't go to school and there was nobody there supervising, he felt compelled to begin to preach on the street and to share his testimony. Well, as he would preach on the sidewalk to anyone that would stop to listen, they couldn't understand a word he said. His speech impediment was so severe that no one could understand him, but he continued to preach the gospel on the streets. The more he preached and the more he shared the love of Jesus Christ with passing strangers, the more understandable he became. There's a combination here of God's healing power and restorative intervention, and the young boy just kept talking. He wouldn't stop. And so between the two, between the elements of human effort and the grace of God, he became understandable. He still has a little bit of a touch that you can hear, and I know it just reminds him of what God has done miraculously in his life. Eventually, Al was noticed by some influential people that were ministers, and he became the National Crusade Director for Nicky Cruz Ministries. You might recall that Nicky Cruz was the leader of the Hispanic gang in New York that was converted in the meetings held by David Wilkerson, and whose story later made famous by the book and the resulting movie called The Cross and the Switchblade. So you can imagine back in the day that Nicky Cruz got a lot of bookings. He had a lot of places to go to share his testimony as the former leader of the gang that was actually coming into the gospel meeting held by David Wilkerson, a pastor from upstate New York, and they had plans to rob the offering. That's why they came in. Before the day was over, they were the ushers that were receiving the offering for David Wilkerson, and you can read that book for yourself. Today, my friend Al Cortez pastors a church in Texas where I have had the privilege to speak on Mission Sunday and give this report to his congregation. Things about him I told that they didn't know, and a few things that he was surprised about himself and his effect upon Kamchatka. During the crusade held in the main outdoor soccer stadium in the middle of the brutal Russian winter. That's just not a good idea, is it? In the middle of the winter, near Siberia, to have an open-air evangelistic meeting? Well, there's not anybody going to come. Well, obviously, they're not playing soccer. And they were more than willing to rent him the stadium in the middle of the winter because nobody's going to come anyway. But they did. Hundreds and hundreds of Russians were wonderfully saved and healed and filled with the baptism of the Holy Spirit under the leadership and partnership of two men that have since become friends of mine, came from Ukraine. And I'll just give you their first names to protect their identity, Anatoly and Nikolai. They founded a much-needed church to be established there in Petropavlovsk, Kamchatka, to shepherd, to pastor, to discipline, disciple, if you will, those that had been saved in the Shambha revival. These two men took that original group of 600 and began to foster what has now become a mother church in Kamchatka to about 45 outreach churches. Well, you can see there's a gap there, there's a need. If God has plans for you to begin to mother churches and start churches and plant churches throughout this region, you're going to have something in the middle. So what I call the vision of a Bible school begins. We got to have some way to facilitate reaching the people outside the capital city in the villages. Because so many new Christian converts are being called into ministry, they needed further training, which prompted the church to plan to open a 2-year Bible college to provide training for pastors. It's the only place I've been to on the face of the earth where there are people of every age, and yet spiritually they're all the same age, because they all got saved, the original 600, in the same meeting. So the older people are not older Christians and mature Christians. The younger people are not lagging behind. Everybody's the same age, and they celebrate in a very unusual way the anniversary of that particular meeting, because that's when we all got saved. It's just an amazing thing to watch and be a part of. At the time, I was pastoring in Alaska and was invited through Franklin Graham's organization. They contacted me and invited me to speak at this new Bible school. Well, they initially said, are you interested in teaching in Russia? I said, yes, but I don't have an invitation. Today you can travel fairly freely. Back in the 90s, you had to have a letter of invitation from a Russian government official to invite you to come, and then with that letter in hand, you could apply for a visa. You may not get it. I've been denied 3 times with a letter in hand, and for some little technical reason, they go, no, you can't come in now. So it's something. You have to get an invitation from the government, not just from a church or a pastor or somebody. You know, they're just kind of superfluous in the situation. A few years later, I joined the staff at the school as an adjunct teacher on staff. I then taught there each fall and spring semester for over 5 years, and eventually I taught classes intermittently for a total of 18 years. Between 12 ministry trips into Kamchatka and Central Siberia, I've spent considerable time and effort teaching in the remote areas of Far East Russia. My experience includes invitations to speak at government-run universities in the cities of Novosibirsk and Novokuznetsk in central Siberia. Quite an experience that wouldn't happen in this country ever, not ever. I need to tell you the story of Boris. I hope you're with me on this high-speed testimony rendition. Boris was a young man who spent his life in training, in education, and in working for the Soviet government, and later now for this new Russian organization. From the American perspective, the Soviets and the Russians are the same, but let me assure you, they are not. The Soviets were the hated government of the old regime. The Russians are a whole new can of worms. It isn't that they're so wonderful, but I assure you the Russians are different from the Soviets. Why didn't the people revolt? Why didn't the people say anything? It was too dangerous. And so we assumed a lot of wrong things, that they didn't understand they were being taken advantage of. They didn't understand they were being lied to by their government. They didn't understand. They understood every bit of it, and much more than we do. Well, from the time of Boris' youth through college and as an adult, Boris has been groomed and trained first as a computer programmer. This man has a sharp, quick, intelligent brain, but that's his cover job. That's how he essentially is justified in making his salary. But his real training and his real job is to function as an anti-Christian debater, as an infiltrator, and an agitator. That's his real job as far as the Russian government is concerned, and he is fully committed to that and actually enjoys what he does. Boris is a man, an avowed atheist and lifelong communist. I hope that can soak in before we go on, who was sent by the Russian government to the Shamba crusade. He's the man that has an assignment to challenge, to disrupt, and to literally break up the meetings. While they rented them the facility, that's on the monetary side. But that doesn't mean that the government approves or likes what's going on. So imagine this picture, if you will. Boris leaves his apartment that evening with his communist, atheist wife wishing him well. Okay? Boris enters the crusade meeting to fulfill his assignment, as he intends to cause disruption and trouble in the crusade. As he's waiting for the exact opportune moment to disrupt, he begins to carefully listen to Brother Shamba as he is preaching a salvation message. He's gathering information. He's gathering what I call ammunition, because he's going to use this against. So I really call this an unusual conversion, and you'll scratch your head along with me. At the end of the sermon, Shamba instructed everyone in the soccer stadium to stand to their feet and repeat what he would say. He then led the crowd, the entire crowd, and there were few believers there, but he led the entire crowd in a prayer of confession, what we would call the sinner's prayer. Okay, so it's repentance, it's confession, it's acceptance of Jesus, belief in who he is and what he has done. You understand the prayer. Boris decided to play along and humor Shamba. I know this is going to cross-cut some of your doctrine, and it does mine as well. And he repeated the words that Brother Shamba instructed him to say, just like everybody, the whole crowd, thousands of them. You see, Boris is planning to use these particular statements to prove to whom he considered to be these stupid religious people that simply there is nothing to this Christianity. This is nothing. It's not meaningful. It's not real. It's fantasy. You guys are making this stuff up, and I'm going to just clean your clock in just a few minutes. Well, there's a problem. I've recorded Boris' testimony in Russian. Have it in my archives somewhere. But in his words, he said, I said the words, and something happened to me. Something happened. he didn't say them from a sincere heart, but his heart must have been crying out. His brain said, I'm gathering information. His heart needs what Shambach is offering. He goes down to the field because he's upset. Shambach wants everybody to come down so he can pray for them. Boris goes down because he's upset. He's angry. And part of his thought process was, how did they cast the spell on me? Because he knew something had changed. He knew something had changed in him, even though he had not been convinced. It's just an amazing arrangement. He was one of hundreds that night who were now on the field. The team of Shambach and Al Cortez, my friend, were praying for each and every person. And the people had lined up around the soccer field on what would be the track, 4 deep. And it's cold. And they're going to, the friends that I know would say, let's just have a mass prayer and get inside somewhere and get somewhere where it's warm. Oh no. Shambach says, we're praying for every person. We're going to lay hands on them and pray for them. Well, they prayed, and they prayed, and they prayed. You see, they're not going anywhere except back to the hotel room. And so, as Al Cortez explained to me in later years, he became more upset with the whole situation. That old man just kept praying for people until they'd been standing out in the cold for 4 hours. Because he's praying for every single person. And the staff that was with Shambach got so cold. And then, of course, when they got back to the hotel, they found out, then they were really mad, because he had 2 or 3 layers of long underwear on. He had several shirts and 3 coats. And he was ready. He was ready to withstand the cold, and they didn't. They were freezing to death and hated it by the time it was over. But they came to Boris. He didn't have an opportunity to ask his questions or explain his problem to them. They quickly laid hands on him, and he received the Holy Spirit and began to speak in another language. Bang! It seems that God heard the cry of his heart. In his confession prayer, although his brain had decided he was not being sincere as he repeated the words. I don't understand that. I don't understand that at all. But it happened. A difficult task, I call this. Now Boris has to return to his apartment and explain to his atheist communist wife what had happened to him. You'll understand that she had many questions and that Boris was simply unable to answer them. I'm telling you, there was a miraculous change in this man, and even today, I can't answer all the questions that she has about his experience at the stadium at the crusade that night. I've spent many hours with Boris, both in the classroom as my interpreter, and been with him privately many hours. And I can assure you, his conversion was real. I don't understand it. It's the only one I've ever heard of this kind of a sequence of events, how God overrode the barriers to save this man. I think that God had this man in mind all along, and it was now time for Boris to come in to the experience of salvation. I call it an expanding ministry. Boris is highly educated, but certainly not in theology. In other areas, in computer science, in debate, in delivery, speech delivery. Boris became an important part of the growing church and soon became their worship leader. He played the guitar, He picked up the musical part of worship very quickly and eventually became the assistant pastor. You understand, he lost his job. He lost his government job. They let him go from computer programmer and from the anti-Christian agitator that he was trained to be. He lost both those jobs. So now he's really without a job. And what's he going to do? All of his skill and all of his training is in the wrong direction. It's not that he's not smart or educated or college degreed. He just doesn't have the training for anything else. He pioneered a weekly prison outreach meeting on behalf of the church. Up to that point, there was not one person in the church, congregation, or staff that would go into the prison. Russian prisons are as bad as you can imagine and worse. If you're sentenced to Russian prison, you will die there. Not because of attack, but because of conditions. This is a very dangerous mission because the prisoners were opposed to him preaching. The guards were opposed to him being present because he's going to cause trouble. That's their opinion. There's going to be trouble. And when they did have a conversion, occasionally it would happen, before Boris and his team would get out of the gate, the other prisoners would descend upon the convert and beat him within an inch of his life. Immediately. First hour. Well, because of his keen mind, his extensive education, and his passionate love shown in evangelism, Boris was then approached and asked to be the superintendent of the new Bible school. Well, so the new Bible school grows. Boris, after thought and prayer, respectfully declined. He knew nothing about such a school, and he understood that he was not qualified. He's qualified for other things. He's not qualified to be the superintendent of a Bible school. He knew that he needed to attend such a school. He needs to be a student. And the pastor has explained to him that he would not be teaching classes, but he would supervise and administrate the operation. Can you run the school? Will you run the school for us? You see, the school is going to use their personal contacts of pastors that would arrange for established Christian leaders and disciplers that would function as a rotating staff from the U.S. and from Europe to teach the courses. And they would, when your week or two was complete, they would take you to the airport and pick up the next one and just rotate the next. So they got really working with several discipleship organizations. They got some of the cream of the crop to come in on short-term basis because these people were not ready to commit for a semester or for a year, but they would come in for a week or two or maybe a month. So they had this figured out. As Boris served as the interpreter for most of the teachers, he learned a great deal firsthand, effectively, as indeed he was a student with a one-on-one mentoring. I remember several times, especially in the first year or two of teaching in the school, that I would make a radical statement and he would just look like it was just jolting to him. And he would turn to me and he would say again. And so I would repeat what I just said and went on. After the class, I'd say, what's going on here? Why do you do that to me every so often? Say again. He said, well, the first time I hear it as a student, but the second time I hear it as the interpreter. But I can't process and translate until I understand what it means, so I've got to hear it twice when it's so different than any of my thought processes. Well, as the need grew, the school quickly outgrew the rented facility that we were using. We needed something larger. We needed something that we could call our own. We needed a bigger kitchen. We could only feed so many students in shifts. That was very unhandy. We needed a dining hall big enough to feed all the students at one time. We needed something, some room for offices. And what we really needed, among the many other things, is some dorm rooms. Because in the facility that we were using, it was just classrooms and a small kitchen and a small dining room. And we had to find homes with the believers where they would house the students during the semester courses. I was instrumental in raising funds in the United States to purchase an abandoned government facility about 20 miles outside of town. It was a former Soviet youth training center. It was perfect for us. It had dormitories, it had staff housing, it had several small homes where married family staff could live with their children. It had offices, it had a pretty good sized kitchen, and some privacy. Just like it was tailor-made for what we needed. There were a total of about 33 acres, the way we measured land, and about 11 or so buildings. So that they'd used it for a training center for the government previously, they'd built exactly what we needed for the Bible school. It was next to a river. We could catch some fish there. And it was just perfect. So we raised $140,000, and I've got in my notes USD, and if you've traveled, you know what that means, United States dollars. $140,000, had to smuggle the money in, of course. We had it, some of it sewn into our clothing so that we could get past the authorities both here and there. And then we negotiated a 99-year lease with the Russian government. And you understand that nobody can buy land in Russia because the government owns everything. It's communal. The government owns all the land. You cannot buy it, but you can lease it for 99 years. So we had to negotiate that. But then the great miracle of God's grace, as we took Boris to tour the facility for the first time. He became very quiet. He seemed stunned by what he was seeing. It took us a few minutes to realize that something important was happening to him. We questioned and encouraged Boris, and he explained to us the miracle that was unfolding before his eyes. He was emotional, and I'm emotional now, as he told us this was the same facility where he had received his communist training years ago. It was the same buildings, the same land, different administration, different function. God had arranged an unusual set of circumstances to redeem this man who was extensively trained to fight against Russians who became Christians, but now he himself is a believer. Quite a journey in and of itself. And now he's the leader and the trainer of pastors. But God wasn't finished with the miracle, because God had now redeemed the land and the facility from his communist training to be a Bible school where he could oversee the training of pastors and leaders for the sake of the gospel of Jesus Christ. I asked Boris, do you ever think about those days? Those days of communist training? And he said, well, every day when I drive in. every day. Look what God has done to redeem me, Boris, to redeem this place and provide it for us. Be encouraged, my friends, to watch for the fingerprints of God in your own ministry. Even at the very small detail level, sometimes it takes years to come to pass and to develop. And so I've told you about Al Cortez, I've told you about Brother Shambaugh, I've told you about Anatoly and Nikolai and Boris and my involvement with each of them. And I like this phrase, and I'll close. Only in eternity will we know of the many lives we've touched. Only in eternity. What God has done with Boris and with this Bible school is just absolutely amazing. God bless you tonight. I hope that you're encouraged and blessed by the testimony of Boris and all those connections that we've made. God has done something special for us and to us. I was telling part of my story to a friend at dinner the other day, and he says, "This is a movie." I said quickly, "My life is a movie." What God has done and what he continues to do in an amazing fashion, and we're humbled to be a part of it. God bless you tonight. Thank you for joining us.
This program has been produced by A Life Devoted to Ministry, Ltd. Production, and is home of training trainers to lead. We hope you enjoyed this program. For more information or to support our ministry, please visit ldtms.org.